I was just saying I've got this session down the road, and I'm not sure if I'm going to bring a jazz or a P or both, and that's what we're talking about today, right?
Yeah.
Is jazz bass versus P bass.
Which did you get first? Did you get a P bass first or a jazz bass? Let me guess.
Okay,
it was
guess.
a jazz bass, wasn't it? Was it a jazz bass?
Well, no, it was a P bass. My first bass that I rented, my parents rented me a bass from Music One Workshop in Kalispell, Montana, and it was a P bass. It was either like a Hohner or it was not a Hofner. It was some H company, but it was, an off-brand P bass. Yeah. And I remember thinking, because it was a P bass, like, oh, this thing is... I would see other basses, and the one that I had, I just didn't think was any good. And it was actually kind of an awesome bass. I wish I still had it. It was red, I think, with a black pickguard. Kind of like your Nate Mendel when you had that bass for a while. Yeah.
That was a great bass, dude. That was a great bass. That was one of my best P basses, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when you were playing that a bunch.
Yeah, it had a quarter pounder in it. The pickup was a Seymour Duncan quarter pounder, and it just had like this crazy bark to it. It was just like so aggressive. I mean, like a P bass, but like really aggressive. I think that might have been my first P bass. Oh, maybe not.
Really? No, the P bass of Doom, right?
Yeah, the P bass of Doom. Yeah, that was my first P bass. I had jazz basses before. I had. Right. So the history of jazz basses, but honestly, I didn't actually have that many real jazz basses. Like the first jazz bass I had was a 70s one. I think it was like 77, 78. Like the 3-bolt. Yeah, 3-bolt at the back, heavier than the sun.
Yes, what color? What color was it?
Natural, just natural ash, black pick guard. Yep. Man, this thing sounded freaking in the mix. I can remember the first time I played it with a band, it was shocking to me. Like I'd sat there and, like it was a friend's, and I'd gone round to his place and I played it, and it sounded cool. And I didn't have a jazz bass. I was like, oh yeah, he wanted to sell it, so I was like, yeah, I'll buy it. So I bought it from him for something stupid, like a few hundred quid, maybe like
amazing.
£600 or £700 or something like that. Anyway, so I played it at home. It was cool. It was fine, but nice. But then when the first time I played it in a band and I heard it in the mix, I was like, oh, this is like completely different to anything I've played before. So before that, I'd played because I was a luthier when I was a kid, when I went from school to being sort of like an apprentice luthier, because that was the path that I went on. I kind of ended up playing custom basses kind of like right off the bat. So my first bass was
because you were just at Overwater.
Exactly. Oh, okay, so my first bass was like this Status, and then the second bass was this 6-string, like monster sort of like Overwater bass. And then after that, I had a 36-inch scale Overwater, and all of these sort of like custom basses. Yeah, and they were all active and like that whole thing. So for me, that first jazz bass was just like, wow. Just so cool. What about you?
Yeah. Also, I just have to go back to this. I love that Status. I'm just working on my Scott Devine. Status. Because we'd say, in the States, we'd say status.
Oh, status. It's not even status, is it? Status. Status.
Yeah.
You've got like it's the soft second T, isn't it? Status.
Yeah, it's almost like a D. Status. I mean, there are probably people that say status, but no, I think where my Americans at, I bet everybody is going to say, oh, what's the status on that? Like, if you're asking for the status of a report, you're not going to say, what's the status? What's the status on that?
What's the status on that,
I'm working on it, dude.
What is the status on that? All right, mate, what's the status on it?
Dude, I always wanted a status bass.
I always thought. I'm looking, where are they from? Are they from the UK?
I think so. Yeah, Mark King, right?
Mate.
I mean,
so it's a status.
Yeah, because it's UK. It is status.
Status.
Yes. Yeah, man. Level 42. I mean, I remember seeing Mark King, and I feel like he had one that had like maybe light up markers or something at one point, and headless.
Dude,
and
very
cool.
Yeah, I went to see Mark King in my local sports centre when I didn't know who Level 42 were. Didn't know who Mark King was.
Right.
Had never played a bass. I was just sort of like this. My friend of mine was just like, "Hey, do you want to come along to this concert?" I was like, "Yeah." And I can remember him like coming to the front of the stage, and then suddenly these lights coming off. I was like, what what the mother of God is this? Like, it was insane.
So cool.
It was so cool, man. It was so cool, yeah.
Oh, it's just the best. I remember, too, I feel like I saw, who did I see? Some kind of, like, mid-2000s rock band. It might have even been, like, 311 or something. I don't know if Peanut ever had light up in his Warwick, but I think it was something like that. I can't remember. But, yeah, when, the stage lights go down, but then there's still LEDs lit up on the neck. Boy, when you're a kid, that is, like, it's just, like, cool.
Stu Zender had it, too. Zender had it. Yeah, Zender had it on his Warwick, man. Yeah.
Oh, dude, Stuart Zender. I mean, holy crap, man.
That album, dude.
Holy crap.
Oh, well, the first 2 or 3 albums, wasn't it?
He just changed stuff.
Yeah.
He's such a beast. Do you know him?
Well. I've never met him. Do you know him? Never met him. Nick knows him. So Nick, the production manager here at SBL, he knows him. But, he did change stuff. That band, man.
Oh, dude. Jamiroquai. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
do you have a Jamiroquai recommend? I mean, there's an album of theirs that I love. I didn't get to them until kind of later. I went back to the Zender era. So I got into them at a record called Dynamite, which I believe Paul Turner, who plays with them now.
That's Paul Turner, yeah.
Yeah, but he didn't play everything. I was looking in the liner notes, and there's I think 3 or 4 bass players on that record, but Paul played some. But I love that record. Might be Nick Fife.
Might be Nick Fife on it. Yeah.
Maybe.
Which one was that?
I went backwards then to find Zender. Dynamite.
Oh, yeah, that was 2005, yeah.
Dude, that's a long time ago.
Man, 2005.
Crazy.
That's crazy, isn't it? Well, it was this, somebody made this, like, I read this statement somewhere. Let me get it right so I don't butcher it. It was like, wait a minute, like 40, 50, 60, 70. Oh, yeah, so 90. We're 2022, aren't we? So 2022.
I just hate what you're about to say. I just hate it already.
The gap between this is bonkers. The gap between 1940 and 1970. Just imagine what happened between 1940 and 1970. Do you know what I mean? Like different freaking worlds. The gap between 1940 and 1970 is the same gap between 1992 and 2022.
Yeah. Oh, it's just awful. And just to think, like, 1940. I mean, I don't even know.
Yeah. Because 1940 is like ancient, and the 70s, well, man, everybody's like wearing flares and it was cool. It was like after like Woodstock had happened, sort of like Hendrix had happened, like Van Halen was about to erupt, and like what was happening in 1940? I've got no idea.
I know. Yeah. Oh, I know. Yeah, some big band jazz, perhaps. you know,
man, like, I mean, people were just starting to play upright bass. It was like it's like
the electric bass still had 11 years till it was invented in 1940. You know what I mean? Leo Fender wasn't even thinking about the electric bass at that time. It's crazy.
Didn't he get it so right?
Yes. I mean,
crazy.
Yes. And, it's interesting because, like, we're presumably talking about P-bass versus jazz bass, or, P-bass, jazz bass, what pros, cons, all that. The crazy thing is, have you ever owned that original style, single coil 51 style P-bass instrument?
No.
You ever had one of those?
You've got one, right?
Yes, you need to get one. I'm going to...
Come on, get out. If anybody's just listening to this, by the way, we are going to be getting some basses out. We're going to be looking at them, so you can go and you can actually watch this on the website.
Yeah, watch it on the website. This is not a real one. This is a custom shop. But when the bass guitar as an instrument turned 50 in 2001, which is 21 years ago, the custom shop made some really dead-on recreations of these slab-bodied, single coil pickup, telly headstock, blonde, kind of, no caster vibe with the black pickguard. And the thing that I will say about this instrument is it just puts everything into context. So, like, when you're playing another bass, if you have some reference on one of these, there's like a kind of a woody hollow bark to these instruments that's so cool. And when you kind of know what that is, it's then fun to see, like, oh yeah. And then the P-bass really changed in 57 to that, split coil thing, what we know today. And to contrast the two is so interesting. And to me, this instrument sounds more like the neck pickup on a jazz bass than it does the P bass that we all know and love. Yet, of course, it's still called the Precision bass. And I love this fact. I'm sure you know this, Scott, that it was called the Precision bass because it had frets, so you could play it precisely in tune.
Precisely in tune, exactly.
Yes, precisely.
It's wild, isn't it? Yeah. Is the neck on the early ones really fat?
It is less. So the nut width, I believe, I might be wrong about this, but the nut width on the early 51 style is slightly narrower than the P bass of Doom, or than what they became in the 60s. They became 1.75 inches, I believe.
Yeah, 44
what do you call that in millimeters?
44 mil, I think.
44 mil, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And then, but the cool thing about, well, I think it's cool, the original 51s, they're pretty baseball batty front to back. And I know you like a wide, thin neck.
I like them almost thin front to back, yeah.
Yes, this is almost the inverse. You may not love this neck. It's a little thinner at the nut, but front to back, it's pretty thick. And there's just something, though, about it, like in the hand, it feels substantial. I don't know. But it's an instrument that I really love. I really fell in love with this style of P bass, probably more so than the traditional one, probably because it reminds me a little more of a jazz bass, honestly.
Really? What, the sound of it? Yeah.
Yeah, like the neck pickup on a jazz bass, because it's that single coil, it's sort of like a little bit thinner. But I don't know, it has a really cool character with flats. It just has this woody thing. I mean, I did, the I Want You Back video for SBL. That was all on this bass.
Oh, that sounded amazing.
It's just a different vibe. Yeah. Thanks, man. It's just a different vibe. Yeah. And the guy, Wilton Felder, who played that bass line, everyone thinks it's Jamerson, right? But it's this sax player for the Crusaders, the Jazz Crusaders, named Wilton Felder. And he played it on a 60s precision bass, but it was a precision bass like this, the Tele bass. They reissued it in the late 60s and called it the Telecaster bass to differentiate it from the Precision. Anyway,
amazing.
I digress.
So if somebody, I guess if somebody's thinking about buying a P bass, would you recommend definitely checking these out, the early ones as well? Because obviously you can get reissues, yeah?
Yeah, for sure. And Squier actually makes a really excellent one, so you don't have to spend a ton of money. Here's the thing. I just think it's important to know what it is. I think it's important to play it, like all the kind of thumbprint basses, like to have really gone through some time playing a P, playing a jazz, playing some kind of short scale hollow body, like all of the things, playing a fretless, playing a 5-string. I think it's actually really important, like to check out, maybe you don't have to own all of those things, but just play one sometime. If there's one on the wall and you think, oh, I'd never like that early 50s thing, play it and see if you can kind of get into the vibe of what it is. Because it just, like I say, it just contextualizes everything. So you don't have to go buy it, but definitely play one.
And it's different to I guess it's different to what people stereotypically hear in their mind when they're thinking about a P bass. As you said, it's a single coil pickup, so it doesn't sound stereotypically like a regular P bass. Yeah, right.
It's thinner and woodier, but then you almost hear there's just a cool character in the high end and mid range, and it's not trying. It was the first one. It was the first stab at it, which is so wild. But I love to play it and think about wow, man, what must Munt Montgomery have been thinking, when he plugged into this thing and went from the upright to this thing. It was such a crazy change, It just, everybody that played these, I just think, man, the bravery of going, being laughed at for, you're playing this kind of weird guitar thing now, and you're not playing your big upright bass. And I love that. I love the history of this instrument and how it kind of overcame the trials and tribulations of it being kind of there's bass and there's Fender bass, that thing, there was oh, do you play bass? Well, do you also play Fender bass? What kind of bass do you play? And Fender bass, they call it electric
Fender bass. Yeah. People used to say I'm a Fender bass player. I'm a Fender bass. Like Danny Mo Morris, I can remember reading his biography on his site or somewhere, or maybe it was Berkeley. It was like a reference that Berkeley were writing about him, and they specifically, whatever bit of text it was, referred to him as a Fender bass player. I was like, I love that. I love
killer.
it.
That is so cool. Yeah.
I'm a Fender
it's kind of like, we talked about that too, like early on, where like brands that start something just are like in the States. I don't know if you have this, but like a Kleenex. Like, not a lot of people say, "Hand me a tissue." They say, "Hand me a Kleenex," but that's a brand. And also, I think I told you this before, but Coke in the South just refers to all soda. So any kind of soda, like you want a Mountain Dew Coke, you want a Sprite Coke. You want a root beer Coke?
That is amazing. Your accents are so good. I just know that you're so great with accents, man. It's so funny.
I'm just working on yours because we're going to pull the old switcheroo. You just need to be working on your American accent. You just need to be saying status and going to see the movie Dune.
Dune, status.
Dune.
It's so funny. Like I imagine sort of like the English. It sounds everything's pronounced quite correctly in a way. It's very crisp, isn't it? Where everything's kind of smooth and cool with American accents. I mean, like,
well, except we do our R's. Like I hear, I hear you. Meta. Yeah, you say meta.
Meta.
I love it though. Meta. Say it again.
Meta.
Meta. It's awesome. And I love that you say you're going to tune your bass. That's the best.
Tune it up. Who's got a tuner? Who's got a tuner? Yeah.
Who's got a tune? Who's got a tuner?
I forgot my tuner.
I forgot my tuner. Dude, I'm working on my divine, man. Okay, now you gotta do an Alice and say, hey, who's got the tuner?
Hey, hey, who's got the tuner? Who's got the? I'm just.
No, you got to get the R at the end. Check it out. Hey, who's got the tuner?
Who's got the tuner? Tuner.
Yes.
Hey, yeah, like it's
the tuner.
Man, it's hard.
Yeah.
A friend of mine he's great with accents. He's great
I
with
love
accents.
it, dude. Oh, I love it.
Anyway,
I love it.
P basses and jazz basses, right? For anybody that's dialing in and they're thinking, and they're legit thinking, and maybe they were like me back when I hadn't played a jazz bass and I hadn't actually, and played it in the mix.
Yeah.
I guess, what's the big difference? What do you see? Because they're wildly different basses. Like,
they're wildly different.
They're wildly. So if people have never played one before, how do they choose, I guess, which one to gravitate towards?
Oh, boy. I mean, I said that I started on a P bass, and I had this weird trajectory of I started on a P bass, and then the first 3 basses that I bought were all Yamaha P basses. There was like a RBX, and then I had a Billy Sheehan bass for a while.
Oh, yeah. So
I had it for a long time, actually. And then I just always, for me, I gravitated toward players that were playing jazz basses. So I saw Geddy Lee, right? And Marcus Miller. There was something about the jazz bass, the crispness that I really responded to. And it could have been for me like the grass is always greener, but I was on these P basses and they felt kind of sluggish to me. Now I came to really appreciate that later, the big meaty tone and kind of, they're maybe a little bit harder to play. But going from a P bass to a jazz bass in the beginning for me, what I noticed was, wow, the P bass necks are a little wider, a little bigger. I'm getting kind of like there's a bigger bassier sound, but there's maybe a little bit more detail in the note, even though maybe a jazz bass is a touch quieter. You kind of have to maybe goose your amp or a pedal or something.
Yeah.
The neck felt maybe a little bit easier to get around. And I just had this feeling young that it was like a step up, that it was sort of like, going from, a rusty pickup truck, to a fine, fancy, automobile, right? Like some kind of, a race car. And then later I'm like, oh, well, the race car is not good for everything. But that's how I perceived it, is like there's a crispness of tone. There's more tonal options. You can get that Jocko thing in the bridge. You can still get kind of a warm thing out of the neck pickup. Marcus Miller slap vibe out of both pickups turned up on full. And I just sort of thought, oh, it's got more options. It's easier to play. It's brighter. And I also, if I'm honest, I just thought they looked cool. Like, I love the offset body.
They do look cool, yeah.
And how everything presents on a jazz bass. I fell in love too with, like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some other jazz bass players, like Daryl Jones playing with Sting. I saw that and thought, like, oh, this guy, and he played a cool jazz bass. And anyway, that's what I perceived to be the major difference. Like, at least in the beginning, how I kind of assessed the two. How about you?
What was the question? I can't remember what the question was.
The question is, like, how would you describe the difference? Or maybe I'm rephrasing it. How would you describe the difference, or talk about your first experiences with the difference between the two?
First experiences. I've got a lot to say.
Yeah.
So in terms of sort of like, I guess I'll say what was on the top of my mind, and then we'll work backwards, because I think it's an interesting thing to say. It's an interesting thing to say, or at least I think it is, right? Is that live? I've definitely, even though like I really love P basses, and I think I'm in my mind, I hear the P bass more than a jazz bass. When I'm thinking about bass, I hear the P bass more. But I've definitely struggled live with the P bass more than a jazz bass. So, for instance, for context, I've been in certain situations with a P bass where I thought it was the bass to take. Yeah. But I found like, it's just not articulate enough to cut through in this specific situation, right?
Right.
So even though I love the P bass, I'm definitely a P bass player. I've been in situations where I'm like, I'm struggling a little bit with the sound to make it actually cut through enough. Like, like in the studio, it might have killed it, but just right there in that scenario, in that room, I'm just like, man, it's just sort of like, it's so bassy.
It's like a tugboat.
Exactly. Yeah. And I've never had that on the jazz bass. I've never had, I've been, I've gigged with a jazz bass and thought, I wish I brought my P bass along, but just really to kind of just sort of like, have a different vibe on the, when I was playing on the gig or whatever. I wasn't struggling with the jazz bass. I wasn't like, I can't make it work for me on this particular gig, because I would be able, I can just put the neck pickup on the jazz bass and I can get somewhat of a P bass sound by doing that. And I think that the neck pickup on a jazz bass sounds wicked. Like, I absolutely love that sound. Yeah, it sounds wicked, too. Right?
Yeah.
So I guess it's, in that, I think that if you were just going to have one bass, if I was just going to have one bass and I was going to be playing it in the studio and live, I actually might gravitate towards a jazz bass, just because of the versatility of it. Yeah. Because of the versatility of it, and because of my experience of being in some situations where I'm just like, I just can't get it to do what I need it to do.
Right.
That said, I do love the P bass. I love P bass players. There's something about the tone that it's like a warm hug. And maybe that's the problem sometimes. Maybe it's like, it is like a warm hug and you need something that's like a little crunchier or whatever.
That's a slap. You need a slap across the face,
Yeah, exactly. But I do love P basses. And my main recommendation for anybody would be to obviously just go try one, try them, because they're very different beasts. And jazz basses are more versatile. You've got a bridge pickup, you've got a neck pickup, you've got both pickups on all at once, so you can get like a combination of sounds. They're easier to play as well. Like legit. I mean, they're just easier to play, aren't they? If you want to sort of like do some pyrotechnics and like zoom up and down the fingerboard or whatever, like you can do it on a P bass for sure. You can do it on an upright bass. I've seen like, some amazing players do that on an upright.
Yeah.
But exactly. But it's more of a physical experience on a P bass, trying to get around. Yeah. And some kind of lines, I guess that on both basses, they, as any instrument, I think, and I'm wildly interested in this actually, is they both kind of lend themselves to a different kind of experience, and meaning that when you play it, you're going to play differently. It might not happen. Great. Yeah, it might not happen straight away. So if you've been playing jazz bass for like 3 years and you've never played a P bass, you will pick up a P bass and you will play it just like you've been playing the jazz bass, right?
Right.
But if you sit with that P bass and you play it every day for like the next 3 months, 6 months, it will actually start to dramatically change how you approach playing that specific instrument. Not the jazz bass. You might keep that jazz bass thing going on, but what it does is it just makes you approach the instrument in a completely different way, which I think is wild.
Yes, I'd love that. And there's something too to let yourself. I would say too that like not everyone feels that because they maybe think that they have a thing and they're going to just bring that thing to whatever instrument. But I really love this idea of letting the instrument, accommodating the instrument. Change your technique, change your hand position. What does the instrument want from you? I think that way about pedals too. Instead of just plugging into a pedal and playing all your licks, like what's going to make the pedal sound the best? What type of playing? Soft playing, hard playing, neck pickup, flat wounds, right? And I think that about the P bass too. Like you plug into a P and you play it and it just feels like each note has more weight or something. So instead, maybe I'd play a boom 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 a boom boom on a jazz bass, but on a P I'd want to go boom 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 boom. I want to play like a little less because each note has just a little more like gravity. And I love that. I love that about how the way a P bass makes me kind of play just a little more economical. Like I don't feel like I need to play as many notes because each note is just like wham on a P bass. And it's so cool.
Just so wide, isn't it?
Yes.
Like the note's really wide and it almost, just because of the tone, because you haven't got the articulation that you have with a jazz bass, even if you do play a bit busier, it just doesn't have the same vibe, right?
Yes.
It kind of sounds cool on a jazz bass, but the opposite sounds cool on a P bass. Just fat and just big and just. I've got a great story Mike League told me. So Mike League, obviously from Snarky Puppy, he's he's a out and out P bass guy, right? Oh God damn, he's so good as well.
He's so incredible. I know.
He's incredible. Yes. Yeah. It's actually frightening. Like, I think that it sometimes goes missed of how incredible he is. And if anybody's like, what do you mean? It sounds a bit like Mike is like, if you think about all of the bass players that are sort of like, known for being kind of frightening, like you automatically think about all of the pyrotechnicians, right? Like the Victor Wooten, the Billy Sheehan, the John Patitucci, these guys with ferocious chops, right? But
Hadrian.
Hadrian, exactly, right? Yeah. But Hadrian, Mike League has got something that is like I just haven't seen in many players at all. He's got this crazy consistency of time.
Yes.
Like he's like every single thing he plays. There's no kind of like he never plays a note out of place. And and even when he's playing sort of like something that's sort of like quite complex or whatever, it's just he nails it, and it's just so freaking perfect. And he's also really in terms of like if you were like, hey Mike, just like play this groove round E, he's got this really great harmonic knowledge, and he's amazing at accessing this around the instrument. He's just a really, really great bass player and musician. Yeah, just a great player. Anyway, all that to say, so I'm speaking to Mike, and he's telling me this. My question to Mike was, when did you start playing a P bass? And he was like, oh, I used to have a Ken Smith 4-string.
Yes.
And I guess that is a Ken Smith 4-string. If anybody hasn't played one or heard one before, it doesn't sound anything like a jazz bass, but it definitely has got the articulation. What's the word? I guess sort of. It's similar in the way that you could play funky 16th note grooves and stuff on a jazz bass. It's going to sound cool. Same thing on a Ken Smith. You're going to get
punchy and bright.
Super punchy, super bright, and it's got this great bass, obviously, And actually, when Mike came to Leeds, because Mike lived in Leeds for a while, he was at Leeds University doing some sort of like student swap program. He had his Ken Smith, and I can remember people saying, I can remember sort of like being on gigs, and people were like, oh, there's this cool guy come over from Texas State, and he's like got a 4-string. I can remember saying, this is a legit.
Yeah, I can't wait.
I can remember saying, oh, what does he play? And my mate Gaz went, He was like, "I was got like a 4-string Ken Smith," and I was like, "Yeah, but it's not 5-string, right?" In my mind, I didn't say it out loud. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you just instantly judged him. You're like, not enough strings.
Instantly, not enough strings. Yeah. If anybody's thinking I'm a complete dick, I was only 22. And apparently, like, I think that when you're 22, a lot of us are dicks. So there you go.
Yeah,
but anyway,
course, yes.
Of course, with no life experience. So he had he had that Ken Smith, and people actually said the same thing about him. I was like, "Oh, what kind of a player is he?" And people were like, "Oh, like, he's not got like loads of chops or anything like that," but they just said he makes everything sound great and he knows all the tunes. They were just like, he just knows all of the tunes. I was like, oh, wow, interesting. Anyway, so all that to say, speaking to Mike about when he first started playing the P-Bass, and he was like, originally I played a Ken Smith 4-string. And he said, and he was on tour with Snarky Puppy. I think maybe like their first tour that they ever did, which is essentially all them guys in a van, just driving, cruising around in the van. Do you know what I mean? Falling out, doing a gig, and then back in the van. And they're on a gig, and Tim LaFave is also on the gig doing, I think he might have been doing Boomish or something with Zach Danzig or something. I can't remember the band he was playing with, but Tim's on the gig. He's obviously playing a P-Bass. And Mike's bass breaks. It's Ken Smith. Something happens to it. And he's like, oh, shit. So he goes to Tim, who he's like a massive nerdy fan of. And he's like, hey, Tim, can I please borrow your bass for this gig? And we're on before. I think they were on before them. And Tim was like, yeah, man, go for it. Yeah. Anyway, so he plays the gig on the P-Bass. Yeah. And he said, and he comes off, and he said, like, the band, all of the band were just like, dude, you sounded way better on that P-Bass. You just sounded way better on the P-Bass. And he said, and I sounded better, he said, because he said the action was big, so I couldn't play any kind of sort of like weird widdly stuff. He said the action was big and it was a P-Bass. And he said, so all I could play was just the parts. And he was like, and he just thought, I'm going to commit to that, and went and got a P-Bass. And then obviously now the rest is history. He always plays a P-Bass. But that's how he got into it. And that's kind of, my own experience to a certain extent with the P-Bass. But I guess an interesting thing just to throw in there, and you know this already, is that I actually hated P-Basses to start with. So I got that jazz bass, as we talked about earlier, you got the jazz bass. The P-Bass came way later for me when I'd started SBL. I'd just started Scott's bass lessons, and there was like a bunch of guys that were just ferociously tearing up, over the fingerboard. They had E to C basses. You remember the era? Everybody had Federa single cuts.
Yeah, tenor fives.
Yeah. Everybody had that. Sort of like Guizdala was doing his first podcast, and I can remember like legit saying to somebody, what the heck is a podcast? And they told me, and I was like, that makes no sense. Man. I was like, that makes no sense. I was like,
somebody just talking out into the void. Yeah, man. Yannick was doing that stuff so early. I remember that.
He was trailblazing, He was like, shout out to him, man. He was absolutely trailblazing with that stuff, really ahead of his time. And in that era, I was trying to sort of like get on YouTube and sort of like do my thing. And I was like, well, who the frick is going to want to look at me? They're going to be like, yo, here's this sort of like English dude with his E to C bass. And they're going to be like, yeah, but there's a sea of other bass players that are also playing E to Cs and all went to Berkeley for like 150 years, and they can play giant steps in their sleep. And I'm like, well, I can join that crowd and try and be that thing, or I can just do something completely different and come at it a different
unexpected.
way. An unexpected way, yeah. And in my mind, I thought, what is the polar opposite to that? And I was like, a P-Bass is the polar opposite to that.
So cool.
So I went and bought a P-Bass.
So cool. I love that story. Yes.
And it freaking worked, dude. It worked. Like, that P-Bass was just sort of like, I feel bonded to that P-Bass, man. Like the P-Bass of Doom. That was, I think, my first P-Bass.
Do you have it back there?
Yeah, man. I've been playing it today, actually.
Yeah, you got to grab it. I mean, this was the bass, too, that I remember first seeing you with. Like, this bass was the one that I was like, whoa, look at this jazz dude playing this cool Fender Relic. I mean, just the vibe of it, just the photo was compelling. Yeah. It's so sick.
It's so good. It's so good. The guy I bought it off actually tried to buy this back off me.
Yeah, I bet.
I felt sorry for him actually because he was working at like a Fender dealer in the UK, and he wanted to get his a heavy relic done. So he just ordered this heavy relic, and at the time you could actually, I guess, sort of like send them designs and stuff of what you want. So there was that process going on, and this was one of the last bases that had that done. So. And he said it pretty much ended up with just one guy. So he said even though it's a custom shop, one guy actually made it. So it's more like a master build base.
Yes.
But just look at the cracks and stuff. Oh, dude, when you play this, you'll be like, oh. And I've got the Moulon neck on, obviously.
I know. When you did that, I was like, sacrilege! Sacrilege!
I know. I want to take the. I want to take the neck off and put the Alinto on it, but I can't do that to the guys at Alinto. So I need them to make me another neck. I need them to make me another neck to put it on this bass, because the Alinto neck is
guys?
The best. Yeah, it's the best neck I've played. It's the best neck. It's so good. I know, but I don't want to take off the Alinto body. Yeah, I want to get an Alinto neck, but it's
just a neck made. Yeah,
that Alinto bass though, dude. It actually,
I need to
hate
play
to
all
say
your
it,
P basses,
dude. Yeah. It's better than the custom shop. It is like, it really is. Like, it just, there's something kind of sort of like really amazing about it. Just like,
man, I got to go to that shop and play a few of their instruments, and they had like a 51 style P bass that was like green or Daphne blue, kind of like a cool old like 50s car color, and it was amazing. And I wish that I had bought it.
We should get Mitch on this show.
Yeah, on the podcast. Yes.
Yeah,
Mitch is amazing.
Like tell the guys about Mitch.
Mitch, the bass player on Instagram, he works at the guitar shop in NYC and is part of the Alinto team and part of the Labella string team. And he's a phenomenal player and a phenomenal hang. He was so sweet to me, man. Like, I came into New York and I was checking out a different bass at a different shop. I was checking out a bass at David Gage, which is actually like a traditional upright shop. Yeah. And I put it on Instagram, and he saw that and he's like, "What? What are you doing there?" He's like, "Fine, but you also have to come here." And it was really sweet, man. I was like, I don't know. And so I did, and got to hang out with Moss and those guys and James. And it was just a great hang. But yeah, man, the Alinto stuff is ferocious. Like, really cool instruments. They make a jazz bass now too.
I was going to say, they started doing jazz basses.
Yeah, man. Right. And I keep bugging Mitch because he's a P bass guy too. And I keep like, "Oh man, you need a jazz bass" whenever he's playing a jazz bass. I'm like commenting like, "Yeah, man." I mean, dude, so check this out. So what happened to me is I had this epiphany with just passive instruments in general. And I know that we're not talking about active versus passive, but my road to the P bass was first started by, I did a studio session with this amazing producer named David Bendith. David, if you ever listen, you changed my life. David Bendith grew up in Canada and then was A&R, and I think maybe even president of Arista, or I might be getting that wrong. David, if you're listening, rolling your eyes, I'm so sorry. But he was a big deal, right? And he was also a killing guitar player and producer. And then he became known for doing like hard rock records. He did a Paramore record, some records for a Brooklyn band called Candiria that I love. And he worked with my band. I was in a band called Down and Above. And he worked with us out in Hoboken, New Jersey, just, across the way from New York City, in this great studio. And I had an experience where I had brought these active basses to play. I had a modulus bass, and it looked like a jazz bass. I'll never forget. He was like, bring a passive Fender. And I said, okay. Yeah, like, oh, right. And I said, yeah. And then I think I said something like, "I've got something even better." And he was like, "Oh, boy." And I show up and I have a modulus bass, and it was a cool bass, right? But it was very bright, very like clinical sounding. And I played it, and he let me play it on the record, which was cool. And then he said, "Do you, because I said something to him about wanting to do sessions, and he said, have you ever played like a passive?" I said, "Oh, a long time ago, but I'm graduated past that now. Like, I'm not using passive stuff anymore." And he said, "Let's do something." He said, "Grab that bass off the wall." And it was a sage green made in Mexico Fender Jazz bass. Probably at the time it was $550 at Guitar Center. And I rolled my eyes and went, "All right." And I grabbed it and plugged it in, and he just pulled up the track that I had played on. And he, got the gain set correctly because it was a little quieter, but now he's boosting the Neve preamp that he's going into to accommodate. So he's using more of his cool gear, you know? And I started to play, and immediately I had this like gut drop of like, oh, like it felt like there was a chewiness in the mid-range. I could hear the texture of the notes. Like it felt like it sat better. We weren't trying to deal with a weird clicky high end that was kind of interfering with the transient of the kick drum. It was just what you should play. Yeah. And I went, oh. Yeah. And he said something to me that really changed my trajectory. He said, look, you don't have to change your thing for this band. Like this band, you can play whatever bass. It's your band. You can play whatever bass you want. But if you endeavor to play sessions, you not only need to tolerate the classics, you actually need to fall in love with the classics. So not like, oh, passive P bass, whatever. Yeah, I guess I have one in case someone asks for it. No. You actually have to listen to that music, listen to Jamerson, fall in love with the way that sounds in that music. It's context, it's lane, right? It's about contextualizing the sound. And with a jazz bass, fall in love with that passive jazz bass thing that Geddy was using, or that really amazing sound that Marcus was getting on those early records. And, you know, like Hofner, fall in love with Macca's playing with a Hofner. Just all the thumbprints, he said, you have to learn how to love them, not tolerate them. And I thought, wow, that was really good advice. And then what it did for me is it just created, I said, oh, well, I need to get my passive bass knowledge together. So I was checking out jazz basses. What kind of one do I want? What era? Then I was checking out P basses. Can I show you my P bass?
Oh, dude, yeah. Show us all your basses.
I have a few, but this bass is a 1965 Fender Precision that I got from Norman's Rare Guitars before the prices doubled.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, and it's a big 44 mil. I think, did I get that right? Is it 44 mil?
Yeah, 44, yeah.
44 mil. And I've got a selection of different labella flats because I like different gauges of the different sets. But it is just, it's in beautiful shape. People always think that it's a reissue. But it's a real 65.
Is that because it's just in such great shape?
Yeah, you know, everybody's like, oh, is that a custom shop or, you know, just like an American reissue? And sometimes on a gig, I'd say, yes. Tickets stolen. But it's so cool. And I don't play it a ton, but when I do, it's always for the thing that, like, it needs to be a P bass. If it needs to be a P bass with flats, this thing comes out and then I go, gosh, why am I not playing this all the time? It's just such a fabulous lane. It's a fabulous lane.
When you play a P bass, is there sort of like what are you doing with the tone control? Do you have it all the way up? Do you have it all the way off? Or do you kind of ride it up and down, depending on the line?
I sometimes ride it, but honestly, live, it's always all the way open because of that thing we're talking about. Sometimes, you know, the tugboat, it's hard to maybe, if the room is kind of boomy or hasn't been treated, I want the most articulation I can out of a P. So I usually do the tone control up, unless if I'm in the studio, then I'm playing with the tone control a bit.
Me exactly the same. Same thing. Like play it at home, I'm like, ooh, I like the tone down a bit. But if you're on a gig, it's like, you just can't hear it, right? It's just like,
I know sometimes, it's so true. Unless the room is perfect and the engineer is perfect. I had an experience too, man, where I played with this artist, Gavin DeGraw, who's like a pop, kind of like R&B, maybe tiny bit country artist in the States. And I brought a P bass with flats. I have a 58 reissue that was made by the custom shop here that I usually have rounds on, but I had flats on it, and I thought, and someone's made the reference Pinot, you know, I thought, P bass with flats, and I will never forget, man, I brought that out, and we played a big show opening for Billy Joel, and a front of house said, man, what are you doing with your tone? And I said, I mean, you know, the tone was wide open, and I said, I'm kind of going for like a darker thing. The MD was talking about that, and he was like, it's just the last guy played a really bright bass, and so this is just a real paradigm shift. And I thought, man, it is harder to get away. I find, same to you, with a P bass, with flats, especially live, if the conditions aren't absolutely ideal for it. You know?
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like for sure. Like I've got and rounds on a P obviously sound amazing as well. That's kind of
so
sort of
cool.
like if you're going to be working as a studio bass player, you need the flats on 1P. And if you look at Sean Hurley or John Button, two guys that come to mind for me as them sort of like stereotypical monster session players down in LA. Both of them have got like P basses with flats and rounds, and they've got a jazz bass. And they've often got a semi-acoustic or Rickenbacker or something like that.
Something as a different choice.
Yeah.
Can I tell you one other thing? When I was, and I would like to hear this too, because you've kind of encountered a bit of a change recently. Like I don't see you playing as much P-bass recently. So I want to ask you a couple of questions. But first I just want to say this. I went through this thing where I said, okay, I guess I need to be a bass player because I'm doing sessions and I'm on the road. There was a moment for me where even though jazz bass was really home for me, I was like, well, Sean Hurley's talking about, there's a great thing for Fender where Sean said something like, P-bass is a real man's instrument. I don't know if you ever saw that interview, but dude, like I love Sean Hurley, but that is such a preposterous thing to say. But I kind of felt it. Yeah, I know. I felt it. I was like, oh, am I not a real man, Sean? I mean, it was just so funny. And I thought, but it really kind of stuck with me, him saying that. It was such a bold assertion. And I was like, oh, I need to become a P-bass guy. There's even a video of me playing with the Noble preamp that they have up on their website where I'm saying, P-bass with flats is the thing that I do for 90% of, because I was really trying to be that guy. And it was, at that time, I was P with flats, and I was kind of struggling with it in the mix a little bit. And whenever I would play a J, I would just go, oh, this is home. I have, a 78 Jazz Antigua. Let me grab it.
Oh, grab that. Well, I love the Antigua finish.
Yeah.
I can't believe that some people don't like this finish. It's freaking awesome.
Those
so
people
good.
are crazy. Those people are crazy.
Perverts.
We don't trust those people. No, I mean, it is a really polarizing finish. I happen to think it's beautiful. It reminds me of, my grandparents' like kitchen appliances in the in the 60s.
Yeah.
But I bought this bass and I played this thing a bunch in the early 2000s, and then I'm like, nope, I'm not a real man. I guess I gotta play a P bass. And I will tell you, when I went back to really taking a jazz out when I felt like it was the right thing. Now, I will obviously play a P bass in a studio thing if it's the right thing, but I hardly ever gig with one. And if I can play the J and I feel like it can be the right thing, I've just decided to re-embrace this. It was like kind of coming back to an aspect of my youth, or a really formative period for me where I was really finding my sound. This was like the first passive instrument that I really connected with. And I have this one as well, which a lot of people, if you follow me on Instagram, have seen this one. It's the beat up
that's my
Sunburst.
favorite one, actually. If you had to have one, which would you take?
I would take the Antigua because it was my first one. I would. Yeah, I would. It's my favorite. It's like it's a 78. So it's the same year as we are, or at least that I am. We're the same, right? 78.
Yeah, 78,
Yeah, and you're talking about that natural jazz that you had. I mean, same year and same just wicked. It's so heavy. But it's what I've talked about this some. This bass is not perfect. In fact, it's very flawed. It has big neck pocket gaps. The pickups are kind of weak. It's super heavy. The workmanship is, a little shoddy, but it's what I learned on. It's how I learned how to hear a passive Fender instrument. And so I just bonded with it. And then whenever I would try to beat it with like a better custom shop version or a better year or something, it just never worked.
What's the other one? What's the Sunburst one?
This is a 68. And this one has flats. And so this is what I use almost all the time when I'm doing like synth stuff, because it's just so mellow. The sound of this bass, it has really old flats on it, and it's just like beautiful and even. And it's a great sort of controller for the synth stuff I do. And it really kind of leans that old school original 50 style P bass sound with just the neck pickup, which I love. But then of course you can, blend of pickups.
And dude, it looks so cool, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, it looks so cool.
I mean, check this out. This was from an era, you can see it in the Natural, where they sprayed clear coat over the Natural and then sprayed the nitro over the clear coat. And then what happened is all the paint just came off the clear coat. So late 60s Fenders are typically like this beat. They're typically so trashed because the paint flakes off really easily. But
so
I mean,
cool.
These two basses for me are my basses. I mean, I love these two. Like if I had to have just two, it would be my 78 with rounds and my 68 Jazz with flats. And I would miss a P bass for sure for certain things, but these feel like me. And that's something like anybody listening, you don't have to always play a certain type of bass because someone says so. You have to play the thing that feels great for you. And that, of course, if you're playing sessions, you have to do stuff that you have to play the instrument or the sound that's right for the tune. And I'm happy to do that. But if I'm making music with my trio, the Orange Goodness, or I'm making some music that I feel like is really connected to me, I'm reaching for a jazz bass. I don't know.
Yeah. Nah, man. I totally feel you. Yeah. And to your question of like, wait, what was the question? I know what I sort of like. I guess what it was, but ask it anyway, just in case it isn't obvious for everyone.
Here's the thing, Scott Devine, P bass guy. Okay, you're not loving a P bass, but then you decide I'm gonna do the P bass thing and I'm gonna be different than all these guys, right? And you do the P bass and you're dyed in the wool P bass guy forever. Then that sneaky 4-string Ken Smith with the frog on it makes an appearance.
Oh yeah,
and things start to get interesting.
Was that the downfall?
Basses.
Was it that Ken Smith? I think it was, wasn't it?
I think it was, dude.
I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah.
I've been paying attention a long time, and then you got that Fodera back that I know that you're giving away, but then you went active modern bass crazy. You're buying Stenbecks, you're buying F basses, you're buying Manets, you're buying and so my question to you is, have you abandoned the P bass? and if you have, why?
You know what? Man, this is a really, I guess, sort of like there's multiple reasons what's going on. So first off, I think like maybe the start of it could be that everybody's playing P basses.
Yes.
And I'm going through that same thing as I did 10 years ago. I was like, oh, well, everybody's doing the E to C thing. I don't want to be like everybody else. So like part of me, that could be part of it. I think that is part of it, right? I'm just sort of like, wow, kind of everybody's playing a P bass now. And when I started playing that P bass back then, nobody was playing like...
That's right.
Like, just nobody was doing that. It just wasn't that era. It was like nobody, like, it was just on the cusp of everybody freaking out over Pino Palladino and that whole wave of stuff happening. It was just after that I started playing it. So there's definitely part of it, like looking around thinking, well, everybody's playing P basses. Maybe I don't want to be like everybody else. So there's definitely that's part of it. And the other part of it is maybe just sort of like exploration of, I've been playing P basses for a long time. So just exploring, maybe just trying to find out, well, if it isn't a P bass, if I'm not going to do that, what am I going to do? And then also, well, I think they're the sort of like the two main contributing factors. But I would also say that another one is that I'm not, in terms of like SBL, I'm not at the front of it on my own all the time now. Stick with me, right? Because
I got you.
What's really, I guess, sort of, I think important for me is that like I have an identity as a musician, and for me that's sort of like tied into the instrument. And I think that when people view somebody, there's a few different things that they attach themselves to. First of all, the vibe of the person, what they say, do they culturally sort of like align? Visually, what do they look like? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
Are they sort of like, are you like me? I know this is kind of sort of like basic stuff, but are you like me? But then also is like, what are you saying on your instrument? And I think that it can be confusing to people if somebody's jumping around lots of different instruments all the time.
I know.
I think it can be a little confusing. Like people are just like,
brand.
Yeah, just tell me what you do. Do you know what I mean? I want to know what you do. I mean, I'm trying to think of sort of like somebody. I'm trying to take it out of bass and think about another kind of maybe a car or something like Steve McQueen, right? Well, can you imagine if Steve McQueen wasn't driving that badass car and he was just driving loads of different cars? I mean, Steve, you've got to drive that car.
I know, dude. I know.
So it's kind of like that. So all that to say, because I'm not sort of like the main figurehead of SBL on my own, I kind of feel that sort of like I've got a little bit of, I don't need to, okay, I'll say it like this. This will be better. If I was like, actually, I need to be front facing on SBL a lot more and really be plowing sort of like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube every single day and making sure that I'm doing that thing. Yeah. If anybody's thinking, well, you do that thing. Well, a lot of the stuff that we do is repurposed, and now Ian's in the mix as well. And there's sort of like, it's not as full on as it was. But if I decided, I'm actually going to plow and I'm going to, be that front facing figure, I would probably, part of that would be I need to make a decision. I don't want to confuse people. It needs to be clear what I am. The value proposition needs to be clear. Oh, he's that guy. He's into that thing. And because I think I'd much rather repel some people and be for something than be for nothing.
Stand for a thing. Yes. Exactly.
So if back in the day it was like it was all about the P bass, it was all about the B15. It was always, it was like that vibe. And I was also saying, but you can also play cool stuff on this stuff, even though it's like the vintage stuff. You can also play these modern lines. That was my stance, and maybe that still is my stance. But it's maybe because I've got like a little bit of more freedom. I can be a little bit freer with my instruments and stuff like that. But I definitely will at some point gravitate back to just one instrument. I know I will because I just did that in my past. I had like a fretless. Yes. It was the only bass I had for like 4 or 5 years. And then I played this other bass, and that was the only bass I had before. So it was, and I kind of like that. I like getting under the skin of a bass and just sort of
having
like
a period with a bass, kind of like
I really
a zone.
Enjoy it. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I enjoy going through that experience. So for me, just to answer that question, it's a bunch of different things, but have I moved away from the P bass? I don't think so. I think it's still my main thing. Or like I always get on a 4-string. There's never any time in my entire life that I've been playing a 5-string or a 6-string, not picked up a 4-string and thought, this is home. I've never, ever. It's always the first thing that happens. I'm like, this is home. This is where I belong.
Yes, and I'm kind of just giving you crap. Of course, I know that P bass is heart, and if you're playing with a certain thing that requires it, you're always going to come back to that. I just actually get a kick out of it. I get a kick out of seeing the trajectory and the exploration. And I will say something for me that is very convicting that you just said of like choosing an instrument, choosing something that doesn't confuse people. That was really convicting. I am terrible with that, because I have so many instruments, and I'll put up a post with a certain thing. I'm playing a P bass, I'm playing a jazz, I'm playing that Voron Saku short scale, I'm playing a Sarek, I'm playing a 12 string, I'm playing a fretless, I'm playing
I'll challenge you, man. I'll challenge you. I think that I'll challenge you in that. I think that collection of basses is your thing.
Interesting.
And if you think about it, aesthetically, it's not confusing at all. So you've got like the vintage P bass things, and you've got the vintage jazz bass things going on, the 70s jazz, in the Voron Saku, and that's kind of got like a vintage vibe. And then you've got the Rickenbacker.
It does.
It's all kind of got a similar feel, vibe, and sort of like aesthetic, right? But if you one day were playing sort of like your 4-string 70s, and then next day you're playing your modulus, your Kubicki, and you're like slapping it, because you got that Kubicki, right? But isn't it interesting that doesn't come out so much, right? And you're like slapping, and then suddenly you're like on your 6-string, and you're like tapping and like whittling. Like that would confuse people. They would be like, Alison, who are you? What do you even mean? Like, because you've got to say something. You've got to say something. You've got to stand for something. You can't just be you can't be the everything guy, because that's the nothing guy. That is basically that's just is standing for nothing. People are just like, that guy who just stands for nothing.
Maybe you're right. I think that, dude, I hear you say that, and part of me knows that aspects of that are right, and part of me really wants to push back against it. Because I think that, like, well, I just think about it in lanes, right? So, like, if I were playing with an artist where, like, a bright Kubicki thing were the thing, I would do it. If I were playing with a big sludgy rock band where that 12 string were the thing, I would do it. Like, I have a value around the chameleon session musician. I used to think this is so terrible for brand. And it's probably self-sabotage. I used to think, I'm going to go on this gig and you're not going to know who I am. You're not going to know what I'm good at because I'm only going to do this thing. Like, I'm going to go on a country gig and you will have no idea that I own any other bass other than this, this P bass. You'll have no idea that I can do anything other than play root fives with a drummer. You'll have no idea. Yeah. And then they would see something on Instagram like, hold on, dude. Like, or I would play in a hard rock situation and I would, but it is confusing. I know. I know that. Well, but I have this thing of like, when it's the right thing for the gig, I only want to do that. Or for the song, I only want to do that. I don't know.
I think it's different. So I think that it depends on whether you're doing that professionally as a musician. I think it's slightly different doing it professionally as a musician. I think that you can get away with more, but I think that if you are going on like a front-facing social media site and you are looking to attract people, right? Let me just plug my laptop in before it dies. You're looking to attract people to your vibe. I think that it's a lot easier if it's clear what you're into. I think that, so I'll give you an example. So, and it's a shitty example, but I'll give you it just as sort of like, because I think people are super simple, and like we are simple humans, right? So you're you're a shred guy, and you go on to Instagram and you find this guy and he's got this 6-string and he's blowing your mind, and like you're like, what the boom, follow, and then. Like the next day, you see one of his videos come up, same thing, shredding, and then suddenly something else comes up, and it's sort of like a completely different vibe, and he's playing sort of like country vibes, right? It's called dunk, like, dunk, 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 and you're like, it confuses you. You're like, like I'm not saying it's bad. I thought this person was
this. Yeah, right.
I'm not saying it's bad.
More
I just
confusing.
think, I think that psychology in terms of how you grow followings online, I think that the devil's in the detail. I think that it's everything. And I think so. Like I'll take you for instance as an example. Why you are a real, and then I'll also. No, I think that you're probably the best example of this. Actually, you've got sort of like a very particular aesthetic style in terms of the instruments you play, and I think that that doesn't confuse people, even though it's different basses. Right. People know it's you. They're like, you've got the thing, and it's not whittle. It's like it's crazy effects. It's sonic experimentation. They're like, they love that, right? And then also the way you dress is always very. What's the word? It's like one day you're not there in your Adidas tracksuit, and then the next day you've got. Right,
there's a thing.
It's consistent, right? So it's consistent. So I think that what we're saying here is sort of like with people, when you're trying to grow that following, it's really important actually to be consistent. Mono neon is mono neon, and he's consistent, right? He does his lines and he dresses the way he does, and that is like if suddenly like mono neon starts rocking up and he's got sort of like a dressing gown on and he looks super boring, and he's just like, well, that's going to confuse me. I'm like,
huh? Or imagine Corey Wong playing a Les Paul.
Yeah, and playing shred so on weird. It, playing shred like sweeping licks.
Yeah, like Slash with it slung really low. Like just bends with tons of gain.
And just as a caveat as well, if anybody's thinking, well, this sounds like not great. I mean, it's like, I'm not saying it is great or it isn't great. I'm just saying like this is what humans are like. I mean, this is.
I agree with you.
I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying like if somebody came to me and they were like, I'm trying to grow a following and stuff like that, and they really wanted to get into the cracks of like things that might matter. This stuff might matter. And look at people
I think you're
Gary
right.
Vee,
I remember,
or,
yeah, man,
they've got all that stuff going on.
Yes, I remember talking to Corey about this, and he played a big jazz box hollow body. He played a telly. He had a bunch of things, but whenever he would play the Strat and would do the funky rhythm thing, he said that's what people responded to the most. So he didn't decide from go that he was going to be a Strat guy. He decided based on the feedback that he was receiving, what was resonating the most. And he said that someone told him once that, hey man, do that Corey Wong thing. And he was like, excuse me, what do you think that is exactly? Yeah, like what is that? Like, what do you think that is? Like, oh, like the funky Strat thing. And he was like, oh, and then he really leaned into that. And I have thought about that a lot for myself of like, man, I wonder if I'd need to just choose, like really just choose the 2 jazz basses or the Voronsaku. I mean, I play that big Gibson hollow body too. And sometimes I feel like I'm sort of cannibalizing my, I remember there's a drummer. No, you don't think so? Well, that's cool. Man. That's cool. I think there's a drummer that we follow each other, and I did like a tapping thing on a Spectre, because I love Spectres because of my love for 80s stuff. And he was like, how have you been hiding this? Like, I did this like...
Was it
yeah, it was that dude. Thing. And he was like, what? Like, hold on. Who are you? But there's part of me that sort of delights in that like there's a couple hidden features under the hood.
There's like it's like an eject button on Bond's car. I mean, just
but it's probably part of my deep-seated, like self-sabotage problems, of like, oh, I don't know that I want to commit to this thing fully. I'm going to do a bunch of things and keep you guessing. I mean,
I love it, man.
I appreciate your encouragement, man. Yeah.
I love it, man. Dude, do you need to bounce? Because you've got this session to go to, haven't you?
Yeah, gotta roll out. I think I'm going to bring a J and a P. I'll let you know.
What should be the closing announcement to anybody wondering about a J and a P?
Here's what I'm going to say, and then I want your hot take too. My hot take is this. You have to play both. You have to know both. You don't necessarily have to like both the same amount. You're probably going to gravitate towards one or the other. But I think it's important to know where each one fits and how it fits you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think get experience with both, and also take into consideration as well how baked into history they are, and kind of respect that, and also like how baked into other musicians' history they are as well, in that other musicians have come to love and respect that sound, and sometimes that's just what you've got to give them. I've got like Mark Saunders up here, who's the bass player for Florence and the Machine, and he was telling me this fantastic story about their second album, and he said they'd done the first album, they were the shit, man. He was like, they'd sold like hundreds of thousands or millions of records or whatever it was, and he was like Billy Big Balls, and he said, and he turned up to the studio, and he's like got all of the rig there, and he's got his like rack of 5 strings, and he's just like, done. And he said that producer just like basically walked up to him and just like handed him a P bass and said, this is what you'll be recording this album on. This, and he was like, what? and then said, by the way, you're using a B15. He said, and he was telling me this story. He was like in the studio, rack of 5 strings, all the amp, the amp maker had sort of like delivered all of this stuff to the studio, and the engineer was like, here's the P bass you'll be using during this record.
Unbelievable.
And he was like
quite
kind of like assertive, and like Mark was like young, and he was like, okay. And he said that he played it, and he said he hated it to begin with, and he said he absolutely fell in love with it, and he said it sounded amazing with the band. He said it sounded amazing,
Yes.
And there's too many stories of that. There's too many stories.
True.
Like Sean Hurley, right?
Yes. Yeah, and bear in mind, everybody, the sound soloed is not ever typically the context of how you're going to hear your instrument. You need to use a sound and pick a vibe that is going to sit within the context of the ensemble recording song artist that you're playing with. if you are able to make that choice, not a selfish choice of what feels better to you in the bedroom, and it doesn't have to be a P, it doesn't have to be a J, it can be all kinds of things, but you need to be looking for the sound that makes everything else sound better. Play the bass that's going to make everything else sound better. And the bass that maybe doesn't make everything else sound better, it's fine. Play that on your solo record. Right?
Yeah.
That's
I
fine.
I had the same experience as you with the guy telling you to handing you the bass, the P bass, and you playing it and it sounded better. Same thing for me. I was down in London doing a session and we recorded all of the tracks. And then the guy was like, can you just try playing it with this bass? The engineer, right? And it was this. And I was there with like a 2,500 pound sexy thing with a spalted maple top. And he was like,
it was so
sexy.
spalted.
And he handed me this bass and it was like, it was a Squire or similar. And I was like, what? Anyway, I didn't outwardly say that, but I was like, okay, I'll record it.
And then
I played
it's just
it, and I was just like, it killed it. Yeah, it sounded way
It's
better.
epiphany, right? You're like, oh no. And then you realize, like, I've been living a lie.
Like in the shower, scrubbing yourself.
Yeah, it is a pretty humbling experience, man. Because, you think that thousands and thousands of dollar instrument that you have. I had my modulus. You had, was it an Overwater? I mean, maybe, something, very spalted, or your Fodera. I hear that too about people that play, I paid $9,000 for this Fodera. It should sound really good in the studio. Well, it's not that it doesn't sound good. It just may not be the right sound for the particular blues band that you're playing with, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing that when you finally wrap your head around the price of the instrument has nothing to do with how it actually sounds in real life. Like literally, you can rock up with a $20,000 Fodera, and you can rock up with that $200 like P bass, and when you play it, I mean, especially if you're working with an engineer that's doing sort of like a lot of kind of like modern day pop music and so, like that thing. They're probably going to be like, play the $200 P bass.
I know. And it's such a mind job in the beginning.
Yeah.
But then once you embrace it, it's powerful, right? It's powerful. Then you can, you don't have to necessarily spend $20,000 to get a great instrument. You could spend $300 and get a cool P bass and do sessions with it for years. So, think about, I guess that's maybe the takeaway, right? Think about the environment and the vibe, what you're playing, and what's the instrument that's going to fit into that. And use that instrument. It's going to make a lot of people happy. It's going to keep getting you work.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong. Also, just to add, there's nothing wrong with like boutique basses either. Do you know what I mean, like with the E to C's and these like $20,000 basses? Take an example, like somebody like John Patitucci, right? So John Patitucci, if you're going to go and see John Patitucci do his thing on his 6-string bass, same deal, right? If he's playing a P bass and you've gone along to hear him do this sort of like fantastic, crazy improvisation over giant steps, you're going to be like, oh, like what is this?
Where's the big 6-string?
So it's the same, right? It's the same both ways. You've got to know it's the same.
Know what you're going into. Yeah, and I've worked with producers too that really like a modern sound. They want the Spectre. I have a Lakeland that is bright and modern sounding with big sustain, big 5-string. They want that. It fits the music. It's maybe like a more of a smooth thing where the bass isn't occupying as much mid-range because there's going to be keys or like it's all good. It's all valid. It all fits somewhere. Now it's just your job to figure out where it fits and what kind of music that you want to be a part of, right?
Exactly.
And then bring that instrument into that fold. Yeah.
And on that note, dude, it's time for you to go and bring that instrument into the fold.
Yes, it is.
All right, dudes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Take it easy. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.